The first scream did not sound like any voice I had known at sea. It rose under the ice, thin as a saw blade drawn along bone, and every man on deck stiffened in the hard blue twilight, breath freezing in his beard as the black water between the floes bulged upward, and something pale and vast pressed just beneath the surface, following our keel. Men have since urged me to set this down, to speak while memory yet holds. If you would keep such accounts alive, give this your favor. And if their voyages suit you, subscribe and leave your thoughts below, as sailors once added marginal notes to worn charts. It began 3 weeks earlier, on the 15th of January 1911, when we first nosed the factory ship Vidar into the pack ice east of the Ross ice shelf. I remembered the day clearly, for the sky over the barrier stood high and glassy, on a pale green arch above a world of white and steel, and we believed ourselves to be very competent men indeed. The Vidar was a Norwegian ship out of Sandefjord, coal smoke forever smearing her masts, with 2 small catcher boats slung from her davits and steam winches that rattled day and night when the whales were running. I served then as second mate, responsible for the starboard watch and the keeping of our dead reckoning when fog or snow defeated the sextant. Captain Hjalmar Nilsen trusted his chronometer and his charts, dog-eared Admiralty issues that showed the coast in vague scallops and broken lines, a reminder that men had not long troubled these seas. We had 4 officers all told, 30 sailors and gunners, and 12 men for the flensing and boiling work when the carcasses came alongside. Among them were Larsen the gunner, square and taciturn, whose harpoons seldom missed, and young Macready, the only Englishman aboard, a boy of 20 who had run away from Bristol and never quite lost his astonishment at everything he saw. By the second day in the pack, the work fell into its familiar pattern. The catchers went out at dawn, coal smoke curling from their funnels, and the Vidar followed more slowly, her reinforced bow pushing aside the young ice with a low grating that shivered through the plates. We took 2 fin whales the first week, then 3 blue, the winches chattering as the blubber strips came aboard, the smell of hot oil clinging to hair and clothes. The men joked that the Ross Sea was kinder than the South Atlantic, and the talk at night in the mess drifted toward homes and taverns, and girls left waiting. I remembered one such evening, and about the 20th, when the temperature had fallen and the lamps smoked in the damp air. Larsen sat opposite me, cleaning the threads of his harpoon gun with an oily rag. Macready passed around a twist of coarse tobacco he had saved from Hobart, proud as if it were gold. We shared it in turns, spitting into the sawdust, and the conversation turned to what we would do with our pay once we reached New Zealand again. "I shall buy my father a new pair of boots," Macready said, staring at the lamp flame. "He never saw much of the world. Perhaps he will walk a little further in them if he knows they came from the Antarctic." "You will drink half of it before you reach the boot shop," Larsen said, but there was no malice in it. He spoke of his own farm near Tönsberg, of his wife Sina, and 2 small daughters who believed the sea to be a rival that stole him away. The men listened with that grave envy sailors show for settled lives, and for a time there was warmth in the cramped iron belly of the ship despite the ice outside. Had I understood how important those ordinary moments would become, I might have listened more carefully, marked every smile and careless word. That night, I took the middle watch, from midnight to 4. The wind had dropped, and the floes lay close about us, dull and flat under a low ceiling of cloud. The engine throbbed steadily, the bow labouring through brash ice that whispered along the plates like sand. As somewhere astern, a pressure ridge groaned as two floes pressed together. Such noises belonged to the ice and troubled me no more than creaking timbers. An hour before, two bells, a different sound reached me, faint at first, easily mistaken for the complaint of steel. It rose from the water to starboard, where the black leads wound in among the floes, a thin cry that rose and fell in slow pulses. I stepped to the rail and peered outward. The lamps along the deck lit only a few yards of snow and ice dust, their glow swallowed quickly by the dark. The cry came again, longer this time, with a note in it that put me in mind of a whale sounding in distress, though higher, almost shrill. "Seals," the helmsman muttered behind me when I remarked upon it. "They yelp like damned children when the leopard takes them." I accepted that readily enough. Now we knew the Antarctic to be full of strange voices at night, and a man who startled at every unfamiliar cry would not last long in those waters. Yet as the watch went on, the sound persisted, always in the same place off our starboard quarter, neither nearer nor farther, as if some distressed creature paced us beneath the ice. Toward dawn, the noise ceased all at once, as though severed by a knife. The engine beat on, the rudder chains clicked softly, but the usual chorus of the ice diminished. No ridges groaned, no floes rubbed. There fell upon the sea a quiet so complete that even the old helmsman raised his head and looked forward uneasily. "Storm coming," he said. "I have heard such hush before a blow." Yet the glass that morning showed only the smallest fall, and the horizon lay under a clear, pale sky. Still, the silence held about us in a curious way, as if a circle had been drawn upon the sea within which the world must hold its breath. It lasted into the forenoon, until the first whale of the day spouted far ahead and the catchers gave chase. And then the ordinary racket of our trade resumed, and we forgot that hour of unnatural stillness. 3 days later, we steamed deeper into the pack, the barrier on our port bow a great ragged wall of ice, blue-shadowed and undercut by caverns that swallowed the swell. The air grew strangely cold, even for those latitudes. I had sailed south of 60 degrees half a dozen times, yet that morning there seemed a sharpness in the cold that bit through wool and leather with a dry, surgical precision. My breath froze on my moustache in a fine white fur, and when I touched the rail with a bare hand, even for an instant the skin burned. Nielsen had ordered us close to the ice edge, where krill gathered and the whales fed. The helmsman steered by compass, though the needle swung lazily, perturbed by the iron mass of the ship and, perhaps, by the great body of the ice shelf itself. I took observations when the sun allowed, bringing the sextant to my eye with fingers already stiffening, calling down the angles for the man at the slate. The chronometer in its gimbaled box ticked with its usual tight arrogance, certain of Greenwich, if not of us. By noon, we entered a narrow lead between two fields of heavy floes. The water there lay dark and glassy, its surface marred only by an occasional shimmer, as if some current moved beneath that did not touch the upper layer. The temperature dropped still further. I could feel it on my exposed cheeks, like the touch of a cold hand. Larsen joined me at the rail during a lull in the work. His breath made a cloud around his head. "It is queer water," he said, watching the slow swirl of black beneath us. "Too still." The whales do not favor such places. There is open water ahead, I answered, pointing to where the lead broadened. We shall be through in an hour. He grunted, dissatisfied, and spat onto the ice. The gobbet froze almost before it landed. It was then that the first smell reached me. At sea, one learned to know many odors: the clean rot of seaweed, the rank fat of a boiling deck, the sweet-sour stench of a dead whale. This was none of those. It came off the water in a thin thread, almost too faint to be certain of. A slick, fatty sweetness like tallow that had lain long in cold, followed by a hint of something else, older and less easily named. I could not have said at the time why it unsettled me, only that it seemed out of place in that pure air. "Do you smell it?" I asked. Larsen sniffed, frowned, and shook his head. "Only the ice," he said. Perhaps the wind shifted then, for the odor passed. Work drew us away, for the lookouts cried that there were blows to leeward, and the catchers were swung out again, their lines coiling on the snow like sleeping snakes. The days blurred together, measured by bells and boilers and the slow accumulation of casks. We saw no other ships. The Ross Sea in those seasons was still an empty quarter, visited only by a few British expeditions and the Norwegians under Amundsen, whose Fram lay somewhere to the east of us near the Bay of Whales. From our masthead, we saw now and again the distant outline of their tents along the barrier, black specks against an immeasurable white. On the 24th, toward evening, the weather hazed over. A low mist rose from the leads, thickening as the temperature again fell. The Vidar lay to in a patch of broken floes, while the catchers retrieved a wounded whale. Lights winked and vanished in the fog as they worked, their steam whistles answering one another like lost souls. I stood on the bridge with Nilsen, peering into a world reduced to grey shapes and the nearest hummocks. The fog deadened sound in an unpleasant way. The usual hiss and crackle of ice seemed wrapped in wool. Voices from the deck reached us dulled, as if spoken through a wall. Only the engine remained clear, its steady thud coming up from the heart of the ship. "Listen," Nielsen said suddenly. I strained my ears. At first, there was only the endless, gentle clink of ice against the hull. Then, far off in the murk, a new sound emerged, very low, almost subsonic, a long moan that rose and fell in a slow undulation. It seemed to move around us rather than toward or away, passing from port to stern to starboard in a slow circuit, as though something swam just beyond the circle of our light. "A berg rolling," I said, though I had never heard ice quite like that. "There is no swell to turn them," Nielsen replied. His lips tightened. "It is some trick of the fog. Keep a good lookout." The moaning continued for perhaps 10 minutes, then broke into shorter, sharper cries that bore unmistakably the pattern of living breath. I heard in them something of the sigh of whales at the surface, yet also a cadence that suggested intent, as if whatever made the sound measured its calls, pausing between them to listen for an answer. When the fog thickened further, and we could see neither catches nor ice edge, Nielsen ordered the engines stopped. The Vidar lay in a little hollow of black water among the floes, her screw still. Men clustered by the rail, staring into the grey wall that pressed close on every side. The cries grew louder, approaching, then died away all at once, leaving only the damp breathing of the men and the strange mute air. For a moment, I fancied that I heard, behind that silence, the faintest echo of our own voices, as if some listener in the deep tried to form our speech with clumsy lips. That was fancy only, of course. We were tired, and such conditions bred illusions. Yet later, when we compared what we had heard, 3 men spoke independently of a whispering under the hull, like several men talking at once, in a tongue just beyond comprehension. Around midnight, the fog lifted as suddenly as it had formed. The catches lay a quarter-mile off, their decks slick with blood, the flences bent over a great carcass. The ice resumed its complaints, the very ordinariness of its noise a relief. We resumed our work. The incident might have faded entirely from my mind had it not been for what happened 4 days later when we reached the eastern limit of our hunting ground and attempted to turn north. The pack grew thicker there, the floes larger and older, ridged by years of grinding. The barrier loomed close on our port hand, a cliff of ice perhaps 100 feet high, its base hidden where the sea undercut it into blue grottos. We threaded away among pressure ridges and narrow leads, the ship sometimes backing and ramming like a blunt axe into frozen wood. On the morning of the 28th, with a weak sun behind thin cloud, the Vidar entered a basin of relatively open water, perhaps half a mile across, ringed by heavy floes. Beyond it, we could see a broader lane leading north. The lead into that basin was narrow, barely wider than our beam. I stood on the forecastle, calling back distances to the bridge as the bow edged between walls of white 10 feet high. Halfway through, with the black water of the basin widening ahead, the ship shuddered under a sudden heavy blow directly beneath the keel. The deck jumped under my feet. A loud banging rose from the bilges, as if some loose weight had slammed along the frames from bow to stern. Men staggered, shouted. From the engine room hatch, a burst of steam hissed, followed by a string of curses in Norwegian. "Grounded," Nielsen called from the bridge. "Depth 9 fathoms, sir," the leadsman cried from the chains, white-faced. "Mud bottom, no rocks." Another blow followed, harder. The sound of it ran along the hull, a hollow booming like a giant fist striking iron. The Vidar lurched sideways, her hull scraping the ice at starboard. I grabbed a stay to steady myself and looked down into the water. Something pale moved there, just under the black surface. For an instant, I took it for the flank of a whale rolling, but it was too flat, too wide. A long, pale shape pressed against the hull, so close that the ice along our side shivered. I glimpsed a smooth expanse of white, mottled with grey shadows, then a ridge or fold that might have been a joint, or the corner of a vast mouth. It slid away into the gloom beneath our keel. "Whale!" someone shouted. "We have struck a whale!" "No whale swims under a ship like that," Larsen said quietly beside me. His face had gone quite blank, the look he wore when something frightened him. And no whale is so white. Below decks, the engineers reported no serious damage. The keelson had rung like a bell, but no plates were sprung. The captain ordered engines slow ahead, and we crept into the basin, leaving behind us only a swirl in the dark water and a silence among the men that no one quite knew how to break. At supper that evening, the talk circled around the incident, each man adding some detail, or claiming not to have felt the blows at all, and as if disbelief might protect him. "Perhaps it was ice pressed up from below," Macready offered. "There are stories of floes turning under ships." "In 9 fathoms of water?" I asked. "With no swell?" He frowned, chopping his meat. "Then some freak of the currents." Larsen said nothing. He ate quickly and went on deck, his pipe unlit between his teeth. That night, I dreamed of long white shapes moving under black glass and of voices speaking along the keel. In the days that followed, we noted other signs, small in themselves, yet troubling in accumulation. The whales grew scarce. Where earlier we had seen their blows in every direction, now the horizon lay empty save for drifting ice. Seals abandoned certain floes altogether, massing instead around others with an almost frantic insistence, their heads raised as if listening. Twice, during the dog watches, a ripple passed the ship in an otherwise still sea, a long, low undulation, as if something very large moved just below the surface. The motion did not match the passage of any whale I had known. It was slower, more deliberate, and carried with it that same faint tallow smell, like cold grease fallen long ago into deep water. Once, when we hove to beside a floe to take on ice for the boilers, we found along its edge a series of impressions in the snow, spaced roughly as a man might place his feet, yet broader and longer, without the clear outline of boot or paw. They ran in a straight line from the floe's center to its very margin and ended there, at the brink of a black lead. There was no return track, no sign of a body hauled out or in, only those curious shallow depressions, as if something soft and very heavy had passed, hesitating once at the edge before slipping soundlessly into the sea. "It is only cracked snow," the boatswain insisted, unwilling to contemplate alternatives. "The wind makes such marks." But there had been no wind that morning. I felt, as I bent over them, an odd certainty that no mere drift had carved those prints. The distance between them matched almost exactly the stride of a tall man. The men grew testy and short of temper. Superstitions, never far from the surface on any vessel, multiplied. Some swore they had heard knocking from beneath their bunks at night, not the usual complaint of cooling plates, but a slow, rhythmic tap-tap, as of someone counting the bolts between frames. Others spoke of dreams of great white faces pressing against the portholes, their features blurred by water, but their eyes very clear. On the 1st of February, now at dawn, the sky cleared, and the barrier shone in a cold yellow light. We turned north at last, our holds respectably full, intending to work our way out of the pack and run for New Zealand before the equinoctial gales. The men's spirits lifted somewhat at the sight of open water ahead. At 2 bells in the morning watch, I relieved the officer on duty and took my place on the bridge. The air felt oddly still, neither wind nor drift stirring. The sea ahead lay flat and black, though we knew by the chart that we still had 20 miles of scattered floes to pass before the open sea. A faint haze lay along the horizon. Then, from far astern, there came a sound that froze my blood more thoroughly than any Antarctic wind. It began as a low, bubbling roar, like the rush of a great waterfall heard at a distance. It rose and thinned into a shriek that seemed to run along the ice, echoed and altered by caverns in the barrier. There was in it a note that made every hair on my arm stir, a pitch that the body heard more keenly than the ear. Men burst from the forecastle half-clothed, looking wildly about, seeking the source. The cry repeated, closer now, and in it I heard, horribly distorted, the pattern of our own steam whistle, 3 long blasts, 1 short. Only we had not blown it. "Who does that?" Nielsen snapped, turning to the engine room voice pipe. "No one is to sound the whistle without my order." "It has not sounded, Captain," came the faint reply from below, delayed by the speaking tube. "I swear to you." Again, the triple long notes, the single short, rang across the floes, this time from ahead, as if something had slipped around us unseen and now called to us from the darkness. The sound scraped at my nerves. I realized then that it did not quite match our whistle. There was a wetness in it, a throaty quality, as of air forced through flesh rather than brass. For perhaps a minute that call went on, circling the ship, sometimes muffled as if from under ice, sometimes clear as a trumpet in free air. Men clapped hands over their ears. One of the younger sailors began to mutter a prayer in a shaking voice. Then, as abruptly as it had started, it ceased. In the silence that followed, the only sounds were the beat of the engine and the thin crackle of ice along the hull. We saw nothing that watch, though all eyes strained into the gloom. Toward dawn, the haze brightened into a band of pale green along the horizon, and the floes thinned. Now by noon, we had real blue water under the bow, the swell beginning to heave again, and it might have been possible to believe that we had left whatever haunted those pack-locked leads behind. I knew better when, that evening, we lowered a boat to retrieve a barrel that had broken loose and drifted off. It was a small matter. The barrel held only salted meat, and Nielsen might have let it go. But the sea was calm and the men restless, eager for occupation that did not involve boiling decks and knives. I volunteered to take the gig with 4 men, among them Macready, whose spirits had recovered somewhat with the sight of the open sea. The barrel lay perhaps 200 yards off the starboard beam, bobbing gently in the low swell. The water there was peculiarly dark, as if some shadow lay across it that did not touch the surrounding waves. As we pulled alongside, I caught again that thin taint of tallow on the air. "Hook it quickly," I said, masking my unease. 2 of the men leant out with boat hooks, drawing the barrel close. As they did so, something white and smooth rose just beneath the surface beside us, parallel to the boat. At first, I took it for a stray patch of ice. Then it continued upward, revealing more of itself, until a length of perhaps 15 feet lay just under the film of the sea, a great pallid arm or fin tapering away into shadow. Its surface looked soft, almost human in the curve of its contours, though of a scale that dwarfed us. Along one edge ran a series of folds or notches that put me unpleasantly in mind of knuckles. It hovered there, matching our drift exactly. The water about it remained strangely still, the normal slap and hiss of the sea muted. I realized then that every man in the boat had fallen silent. Even the creak of oarlocks seemed muffled. Slowly, as if raised by deliberate will, the pale mass bent upward at what might have been a joint. A bulge formed closer to the boat, pressing into the surface from below until it broke through with scarcely a ripple. Something emerged, pale and rounded, shedding beads of water that hung on it like glass. I have never described clearly what I saw then, though it has visited me in dreams for more than half my life. There was the impression of a face, if such a term may be used for a thing not made in any image we know. A smooth white expanse, almost featureless, yet with 2 darker hollows set far apart, too large, that suggested eyes, and below them a horizontal crease that opened and closed once, slowly. No teeth showed, no tongue, only that soft parting, as if it tested the air. For a moment that seemed to lengthen beyond bearing, it hung there, half in, half out of the sea, so close that I might have reached and touched the slick skin. The air grew suddenly very cold. My lungs felt tight, as if the act of drawing breath in that presence demanded more strength than I possessed. Beside me, Macready made a choked sound. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw that he had dropped his oar and pressed both hands to his mouth. His eyes bulged, fixed on the apparition. "Do not move," I said, though my own voice sounded far away. The dark hollows seemed to regard us, measuring without haste. Then, with a curious, almost graceful motion, the white mass sank. The water closed over it without splash or foam. The sea around the boat shivered once, and the normal swell returned. We remained there for some seconds, frozen, the barrel bumping gently against our side. Then the spell broke. One of the men began to sob, great tearing gasps that sounded foreign in that open air. Another muttered that he would not set foot on the Vidar again, that he would rather take his chances on the ice. "Row," I said, more sharply than I intended. "Row, damn you." We returned to the ship in a clumsy, terrified fashion, the oars splashing, catching. By the time we came alongside, my hands shook so violently that I could hardly grasp the ladder. On deck, under the interested eyes of men who had seen nothing, the story seemed at first thin, unbelievable. Even as I told it, I heard how mad it must sound. A white thing in the water, a suggestion of a face, in broad daylight, yet leaving no mark but fear. "Something in the light," the boatswain said. "A pat of ice. The sea plays tricks." Macready, pale and sweating, said nothing. Only when Larsen took him aside did he manage to whisper, "It looked like a man, but too big. God forgive us. It looked like a man drowned long ago and come up wrong." Nielsen listened in silence, his jaws set. At last he said, "We are quitting these waters. There is good enough hunting elsewhere. Until then, no boat goes out except under my order. That is all." He left unspoken what all of us tasted in the back of the throat, that our skill and courage, which had seemed so ample at the voyage's start, now sat all too small against something that moved under the ice and regarded us as we might regard flies on a window. We made north with every pound of steam the boilers could give, counting the miles until the last growlers faded astern and the sea turned the deep, welcoming blue of the open southern ocean. The whales became more numerous again. The seals returned to their usual patterns. To any man looking only at the surface, the world had righted itself. Yet none of us were quite as we had been. Work that once filled the days and left no room for thought now seemed an excuse to avoid the rail, to keep one's eyes turned inward. Laughter came rarely, forced when it appeared. At night, when I lay in my narrow bunk, I heard the creak of the hull and the rush of water, and behind them, always, the faint imagined echo of something vast turning in the deep and choosing for a time not to rise. We reached Littleton on the 12th of March. The hills around the harbour were brown with late summer, and the air soft and full of smells that seemed impossibly rich after months of salt and ice, earth, wood smoke, horses, tar. Men who had faced death calmly when a line snapped or a whale flailed at the boats now clung almost shyly to the rail as the pilot came aboard, as if unsure that the land would receive them. The company agents met us at the dock, brisk and eager for figures. How many barrels? How many whales? What yield of oil? Nielsen gave them their numbers. When they asked about the state of the hull after the encounter with the pack, he mentioned briefly the strange blows under the keel. Perhaps a grounded berg, one of the clerks said, more to his ledger than to us. There have been such incidents. No matter, no matter. She floats and she is full. That is the main point. No one spoke of white faces under the surface, or of calls answered in our own patterns. Such matters did not fit easily into a ship's log. I wrote of unusual ice pressure and audible phenomena of unknown origin, because I wished at least some mark of it to remain in the record, however obscure. In the weeks that followed, as the men took their pay and scattered into the bars and boarding houses of the port, stories circulated in low voices at tables and in corners. What had been seen grew and changed in the telling. Some swore that the thing had laid a hand on the Vidar's hull, leaving marks like sucker rings. Others claimed that a man in the forecastle had gone white-haired overnight. I corrected such inventions where I could, not out of loyalty to truth for its own sake, but because I felt that the reality, as we had glimpsed it, needed no such ornaments to be terrible. When I spoke privately with Nilsson, hoping perhaps for some anchor in his older experience, he surprised me. In my first voyage south, he said slowly, staring at the harbour lights, we heard voices under the ice in the Waddell. Men said it was pressure, the echo of our own screws. We saw no shapes then. I chose to say nothing, and in time I almost believed that nothing had happened. He looked at me then, his eyes pale and very tired. This time we have seen something. We have no name for it. If I tell the owners such tales, they will say we drank too deep of our own oil. If I write it plainly in the official report, it will be crossed out or laughed away. Yet you and I will remember, whether we wish to or not. In later years, I heard that Japanese sailors had a word for certain white beings glimpsed in southern waters. Ningen, they called them, which I was told meant simply human. The irony of that has never quite left me. To them, these apparitions were half legend, half boastful yarn, told over sake and forgotten in the day's work. For me, the thing under the boat in that cold dish of sea remained neither myth nor fable, but a fact that stubbornly refused all explanation. How has it haunted me, you may ask, across the decades that have piled between that voyage and this telling, in ways both small and enormous. Once, in Christiania, many years later, I stood at a fishmonger's stall where great halibut lay white and slick on the boards. The sight of their blank undersides, the soft curve where I should have been, struck me so violently that I dropped the coins from my hand and had to lean against a wall until the dizziness passed. Another time, in the middle 30s, I took passage on a coastal steamer that ran down past Trondheim. A boy beside me at the rail pointed out into the soft northern twilight and said, with the casual certainty of youth, that someday men would chart every depth, classify every creature. His words, so innocent, filled me with such disproportionate anger that I snapped at him, then walked the deck alone until my temper cooled and my heart steadied. How could I explain to him that there are erasures in our knowledge that may be deliberate on the part of the unknown, rather than mere gaps in our own effort? Once, in Bergen, I met Macready again by chance. It was after the war, which he had survived in the engine rooms of trawlers, and he had grown thick around the middle, with hair gone thin and eyes permanently reddened by coal dust. We recognized one another at once, though 20-odd years had furrowed our faces. We drank together in a dim tavern where the air smelt of yeast and damp oak. For an hour we spoke of ordinary things: his children, my work in the harbour office, the price of fuel, the loss of old sailormen's skills. Only when the talk flagged did he say, very quietly, "Do you ever dream of that face?" I did not pretend to misunderstand. "Yes," I said. He nodded as if relieved, though his hands trembled faintly on the glass. "I went to sea again in the south, once," he continued. "Different ship. I thought to prove to myself that it had been a trick of light. We saw nothing. I came home feeling more uneasy than before. For if it was a trick, why has it never repeated itself in any other form? And if it was not, why did it choose us, and only the once, and then withdraw? I had no answer." We sat together then, in a silence that held more companionship than any words. From time to time, over the years, I sought out reports of unusual phenomena in polar waters, trawling newspapers, scientific journals, even the accounts of expeditions. Here and there, I found hints. A British ship whose men spoke of singing under the ice a whaler out of Hobart that recorded in a doctor's private journal the sight of an enormous white limb moving in a lead. Never enough to form a pattern that a rational man might lay hold of. Enough only to suggest that our encounter stood among a scattered handful in which the sea had briefly shown a different face. I married, late, a widow whose patience steadied me more than she knew. We had no children. In winter, when the harbour iced over in brittle plates that tinkled against the piles, I would lie awake some nights and listen to the groan of timbers, the faint cracking of ice. Now and then, a long, low creak would travel along the house as the frost tightened its grip. Each time, unbidden, I found myself holding my breath, waiting for a second sound from beneath that never came. What then have I concluded, after so many years, about that white thing under the Vidar's keel, about the cries that followed us through the floes? Very little that would satisfy a younger man's hunger for closure. I know only that something moved there with intent, that it possessed a form and a presence that could reach up into our understanding and leave a lasting mark, and that it withdrew again into its cold element without offering us either threat or comfort. We were not attacked. No man died of it. The Vidar returned with her casks full and her accounts in order. Yet each of us who saw that pale emergence carried away a wound of another kind, a small but permanent shift in the way we regarded the boundary between our world and the one beneath. Is that not a kind of violence, even without blood? There are nights when I sit by my window and look out at the harbour, at the lamps wavering on the water. A fishing boat will pass close in, her hull black against the reflections. And, for an instant, the wash along her side will take on a certain smoothness, a white gleam just below the surface, and I will tense, though reason tells me that it is only the play of light. And sometimes, in the depths of winter, when the cold settles into the stones and the house speaks in tiny fractures, the water in the cistern shrinks back with a soft sigh, and the pipes under the floor make a long, hollow sound, as if something vast had brushed them in passing.